The radio crackled to life at 3:17 a.m., but no voice came through, just the sound of breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that seemed to echo from somewhere far deeper than any human lungs could reach. Sarah Martinez pressed her ear against the receiver, her hand trembling as she adjusted the frequency dial. Static filled the small observation tower, but underneath it she could swear she heard something else, the wet sound of lips parting, as if whatever was on the other end was about to speak. But it never did. For 3 weeks, Sarah had been alone in Tower 7, perched 80 feet above the Colorado wilderness. The Rockies stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of pine and aspen that should have been beautiful, should have been peaceful. Instead, every shadow seemed to watch her. Every rustle in the canopy below made her skin crawl. The isolation was supposed to be temporary, just until the regular lookout recovered from his accident. But Frank Delacroix hadn't just fallen down those tower stairs. Sarah had seen the photos the rangers wouldn't show her, the impossible angle of his neck, the look of absolute terror frozen on his face. And now, as that breathing continued through the radio, Sarah understood why Frank had been trying to climb down in the middle of the night. Something in these woods didn't want them here. Something that had been watching, waiting, and was finally ready to make contact. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Before we dive into this real-life horror story from the Colorado wilderness, I need to ask, where are you watching from tonight? Are you safe in your bed, or are you somewhere darker? Hit that like button if you're brave enough to hear what Sarah discovered in those woods. Subscribe if you want more true terror stories that'll make you question every shadow. And please leave a comment telling me if you've ever felt like something was watching you from the darkness. Trust me, after tonight's story, you'll never look at the forest the same way. 3 months earlier, Sarah Martinez had been desperately scrolling through job listings in her cramped Denver apartment. At 28, she was drowning in student loan debt from her abandoned PhD in environmental science, working dead-end temp jobs that barely covered rent. When the Forest Service posting appeared, fire lookout, remote location, excellent pay. It seemed like divine intervention. 3 months of solitude in the mountains, scanning for smoke and recording weather data. How hard could it be? The orientation had been brief. Ranger Captain Mike Torres handed her a thick manual, a satellite phone, and the keys to a government truck. Tower 7 is our most remote station, he'd explained, his weathered face serious. 40 miles from the nearest road, another 20 from that to civilization. You'll have supply drops every 2 weeks, radio check-ins daily at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. The tower's fully equipped solar panels, water filtration, enough canned goods to last months. Sarah had nodded eagerly, already imagining the peaceful mornings, watching sunrise over the peaks, the evenings reading by lamplight. She'd grown up camping with her father in these same mountains before cancer took him. This job felt like coming home. The drive to Tower 7 took 4 hours on increasingly rough roads. The last 10 miles were barely a trail winding through dense forest where the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. Ancient pines pressed close to the path, their branches scraping against the truck like gnarled fingers. Sarah had felt a chill then, but attributed it to the elevation. At 8,000 feet, the air was thin and cold, even in late summer. The tower itself was impressive, a steel structure rising from a small clearing with a glass-walled observation room at the top and a modest cabin at its base. Solar panels glinted on the roof, and a weather station's instruments turned slowly in the mountain breeze. It looked exactly like the photos, clean and modern despite its remote location. What the photos hadn't shown were the scratches. Deep gouges in the tower's steel legs, too high for any bear to reach. Scratches that spiraled upward in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost intelligent. Sarah had run her fingers along them that first day, noting how the metal was twisted outward as if something with incredible strength had tried to climb up from below. The cabin's previous occupant had left few personal traces. Frank Delacroix had been a 20-year veteran of the fire service, according to his file. But scattered among his practical gear, Sarah found odd things, salt lines across every windowsill, mirrors hung facing the forest, and a journal with pages torn out. The remaining entries were mundane weather observations until the final week, when Frank's handwriting became increasingly erratic, filled with references to movement in the tree line and the sound they make. Sarah had assumed the old man had simply succumbed to isolation madness. Mountain solitude could break anyone after enough time. She was younger, stronger, better educated. She understood the psychological effects of prolonged isolation and was prepared for them. She wasn't prepared for the reality that Frank Delacroix had been completely sane. The first sign came on Sarah's fourth day during the routine evening radio check. She'd been settling into a comfortable rhythm: morning weather observations, afternoon reading evening reports to base station. The job was exactly what she'd hoped: peaceful, solitary, meaningful. She was making a difference, protecting thousands of acres of wilderness from wildfire. Tower 7 to base. This is Sarah checking in for evening report. She spoke into the radio microphone, watching the sun paint the peaks orange and gold. Copy that, Tower 7. Go ahead with your report. As Sarah began reciting wind speeds and humidity readings, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Something large was shifting among the trees at the clearing's edge, about 50 yards from the tower's base. She turned her head slightly, trying to maintain focus on her radio report while observing whatever was out there. Visibility excellent, no signs of smoke or fire activity. She continued, but her voice faltered as the movement became more distinct. It was a figure, human-shaped but wrong somehow, standing motionless between two massive pine trees. The distance and fading light made details impossible, but Sarah could see it was tall, taller than any person should be, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its body. Tower 7. You're breaking up. Please repeat your last. Sarah forced herself to look away, focusing on the radio. Sorry, base. I said no fire activity observed. All clear for tonight. Copy that. Have a good evening, Tower 7. When Sarah looked back toward the tree line, the figure was gone. But the trees where it had stood were still swaying despite the absence of any wind. She spent the next hour convincing herself it had been a trick of light and shadow. The mountains were full of optical illusions. Ranger training had covered that extensively. Pareidolia, the tendency to see familiar patterns in random shapes. Rock formations and tree clusters could easily resemble human figures, especially in changing light conditions. But as darkness settled over the forest, Sarah found herself checking and rechecking the locks on the cabin door. She'd inherited a powerful spotlight from Frank's equipment, and she found herself sweeping it across the tree line every few minutes. The beam revealed nothing but normal forest pine trunks, underbrush, the occasional gleam of animal eyes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Sleep came fitfully that night. Sarah had moved her cot directly beneath the tower for the first time, preferring the steel and glass sanctuary to the vulnerable cabin below. Around 2 a.m., she was jolted awake by a sound that seemed to come from directly beneath the observation room. Scratching. Metal on metal, rhythmic and persistent. Sarah lay frozen, listening to the sound grow louder. It was definitely coming from the tower's structure, and it was moving upward. Something was climbing the steel framework, its claws or tools scraping against the metal rungs with each deliberate movement. She grabbed the spotlight and crept to the window, hands shaking as she aimed the beam downward. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the tower's framework, and nothing else. The scratching stopped immediately, as if whatever was making the sound knew it was being observed. But when Sarah moved the light away, the scratching resumed. For 20 minutes, this pattern continued. Light revealed nothing. Darkness brought the sound back closer each time. Sarah realized with growing horror that whatever was making the noise was learning, adapting to her responses. It was intelligent enough to recognize the threat of illumination and patient enough to wait. By dawn, the scratching had stopped entirely. In the morning light, Sarah climbed down to examine the tower's base. The scratches she'd noticed on her first day were deeper now, more extensive. Fresh metal shavings glinted in the grass around the tower's foundation. Whatever was doing this possessed incredible strength and persistence. Sarah's morning radio check was professional but tense. She reported normal weather conditions and denied any issues when Ranger Torres asked if everything was all right. How could she explain that something was trying to reach her in the night? That the scratches on the tower were growing larger and more aggressive? Without evidence beyond her own observations, she'd sound exactly like Frank Delacroix had in his final reports. Paranoid, unstable, suffering from isolation psychosis. But as Sarah watched the tree line throughout that day, she began to understand that Frank's final weeks hadn't been madness at all. They'd been a desperate attempt to document something that shouldn't exist, something that lived in the spaces between rational explanation and primal terror. The figure appeared again that afternoon, this time closer to the tower, still at the forest's edge, but in a different location, as if it was slowly circling the clearing, studying her routine. Sarah grabbed her binoculars and focused on the shape, her breath catching as details became clear. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with pale skin that seemed to shift and ripple in the sunlight. Its limbs were disproportionately long, ending in hands that appeared to have too many fingers. But it was the face that made Sarah's stomach clench with fear. Even at a distance, she could see it was wrong features that almost resembled human arrangement, but were stretched and distorted like a photograph that had been pulled apart and reassembled by someone who only half remembered what people looked like. And it was looking directly at her. Sarah lowered the binoculars, her hands trembling. When she raised them again, the figure had moved. Not walked, but somehow shifted position instantaneously. It was now standing 20 yards closer still at the clearing's edge, but definitely advancing. She grabbed the satellite phone and dialed Ranger Torres's direct line. "Torres here. Mike, this is Sarah at Tower 7. I need to report something unusual." "What kind of unusual?" Sarah stared at the tree line. The figure was gone again, but she could feel it watching from somewhere in the shadows. "I think there might be someone living out here. Someone who doesn't want me here." Ranger Torres arrived 2 days later with a grim expression and a well-armed partner. Sarah had spent those 48 hours in a state of constant vigilance, the tall figure appearing with increasing frequency around the clearing's perimeter. Sometimes it stood motionless for hours. Other times it would vanish the moment she looked directly at it, only to reappear from an impossible angle minutes later. "Show me everything," Torres said without preamble as he climbed the tower stairs, Deputy Ranger Carol Vega close behind. Sarah led them through her documentation photographs that showed nothing but empty forest audio recordings of the nighttime scratching that somehow hadn't captured on her phone sketches of the figure that looked like a child's drawing of a nightmare. Torres examined each piece of evidence with professional skepticism while Vega swept the clearing with tactical precision. "Sarah, I understand isolation can create very convincing hallucinations," Torres began gently. "The mind tries to fill empty spaces with familiar patterns. After Frank's incident—" "What really happened to Frank?" Sarah interrupted. "The official report said he fell, but I've seen the photos. No one falls and lands like that." Torres exchanged a glance with Vega before answering. "Frank called in similar reports for 2 weeks before his death. Claimed something was stalking the tower trying to get inside. We found him at the base of the tower at 3 a.m., like he'd been trying to escape in the dark." "And you think he was hallucinating too?" "I think," Vega said carefully, "that this particular location has a history. Tower 7 has had more incidents than any other station. Equipment failures, psychological breaks, accidents. We've recommended closing it down, but the Forest Service insists it's too strategically important." "Incidents like what?" Torres pulled out a thick file. 1987 Lookout reported massive humanoid shapes moving through the forest. Found dead from apparent heart attack. 1994 Lookout claimed the tower was being hunted by something intelligent. Disappeared entirely, never found the body. 2003 Lookout lasted 1 week before abandoning his post, claiming something was learning his patterns. 2011 Lookout. "How many?" Sarah whispered. 17 incidents over 40 years. 8 deaths, 3 disappearances, 6 psychological breaks requiring hospitalization. Frank was just the latest. Sarah stared at the file, her mind reeling. "And the Forest Service keeps sending people here, with better equipment each time," Vega said grimly. "Better communication, better psychological screening, better training. They're convinced it's an environmental factor, altitude isolation, some kind of natural phenomenon affecting brain chemistry." "But you don't think so?" Torres closed the file. "I think some places are just wrong. I think Tower 7 sits on land that shouldn't be occupied by humans, and something lives here that wants it back." That evening, after the Rangers departed with promises to check on her daily, Sarah sat alone in the observation room and tried to process what she'd learned. 17 people had experienced something similar to what she was going through. Most had died or disappeared. The ones who survived were dismissed as suffering from isolation psychosis. As darkness fell, the scratching began again, but this time it was different. Instead of the random scraping she'd grown accustomed to, the sounds came in patterns. 3 short scratches, 3 long ones, 3 short again. Morse code for SOS. Whatever was down there was asking for help. Sarah grabbed the spotlight and aimed it downward, but as always, the light revealed nothing. The scratching continued, the SOS pattern repeating over and over with desperate intensity. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden, Sarah crept to the observation room's external speakers. "I can hear you," she called into the darkness. "What do you want?" The scratching stopped immediately. For several minutes, the forest was utterly silent. No wind, no insects, no night sounds of any kind. Then, from directly below the tower came a voice. "Help me!" It was human speech, but wrong in every way possible. The words seemed to come from multiple throats, speaking in unison, creating harmonics that made Sarah's teeth ache. The voice was neither male nor female, but something in between, as if the speaker didn't quite understand how human vocal cords were supposed to work. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered into the microphone. "Lost, so lost, can't find the way back. Back where are you trying to go?" The response came after a long pause, and when it did, Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "Home. Want to go home, but the thing won't let me leave. It keeps my body, uses my face, wears me like clothes." Sarah backed away from the window, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "Frank, is that you, Frank?" "All of us," the voice replied. And now Sarah could hear the multiple speakers more clearly, different voices layered together speaking in unison. "All trapped here, can't leave. It takes our shapes, learns our voices, feeds on our fear." "What is it? What's keeping you here? Ancient, hungry, been here since before the trees, before the mountains, sleeps deep in the earth until something warm comes too close." Through the observation room's windows, Sarah began to see lights moving in the forest. Pale phosphorescent glows that drifted between the trees like oversized fireflies. As she watched, the lights began to take shape, forming the outlines of human figures. Tall, distorted figures that moved with the jerky, uncertain gait of marionettes. "It makes us walk," Frank's voice continued from below. "Makes us pretend to be alive. Uses us to lure others deeper into the forest, away from the tower's protection. Protection, steel and height. It can't climb smooth metal, can't reach above the tree line, but it's patient. It waits until hunger makes us come down." Sarah looked around the observation room with new understanding. The tower wasn't just for fire watching, it was a refuge. A lighthouse keeping something dark at bay. But like all refuges, it was only temporary. Eventually, supplies would run low. Eventually, human nature would drive its occupant to seek contact with the outside world. "Frank, how long have you been dead? Time moves strangely here. Days feel like years, years pass like minutes. Been watching you for forever yesterday. Can't remember life anymore, only this existence." The phosphorescent figures were closer now, standing at the very edge of the clearing. In the moonlight, Sarah could make out details that made her stomach lurch. They were human-shaped but clearly wrong limbs, bent at impossible angles, faces that shifted and flowed like melting wax movements that ignored basic physics. "What does it want from me?" "Same as always. Fear first, to make the meat tender, then the body to wear as camouflage, then the soul to add to its collection. How do I fight it?" Frank's laugh was like breaking glass. "You don't fight something that old, something that patient. You only survive until it gets bored or finds easier prey. But the other lookouts, they tried to run. Running only brought them closer. It herds its prey like a wolf, driving them deeper into territory where no human rescue can reach. The tower is safest, but safety is just delayed death. Eventually, hunger wins. Eventually, madness wins. Eventually, everyone comes down." As if summoned by Frank's words, the phosphorescent figures began to move in perfect synchronization, walking across the clearing in a complex pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. They were preparing something, Sarah realized. Building to something. "Frank, what's happening? It's ready for you now. Finished learning your routines, your fears. Tonight, it will try to make you come down." "How?" But Frank's voice had faded, leaving only the sound of multiple sets of footsteps circling the tower base. The phosphorescent figures moved faster now, their dance becoming more frenzied. Sarah watched in horror as they began to climb over each other, forming a tower of writhing bodies reaching toward her observation room. They were building a ladder out of the dead. The tower of bodies rose with impossible speed, twisted limbs interlocking like the bones of some massive skeleton. Sarah pressed herself against the observation room's back wall, watching in paralyzed terror as pale faces appeared at window-level, faces she recognized from missing persons reports, from old Forest Service photos, from Frank Delacroix's personnel file. But it was the face at the top that made her scream. Her own face, perfect in every detail except for the eyes. Where Sarah's brown eyes should have been twin black voids, stared back at her empty spaces that seemed to pull light into their depths. The thing wearing her appearance smiled, with her mouth spoke with her voice. "Let me in, Sarah," it said gently, tapping on the glass with fingers that were just slightly too long. "You must be so lonely up here, so afraid. I understand. I've been watching you, learning how to help." "You're not me," Sarah whispered, fumbling for the radio microphone. "Aren't I the false?" Sarah tilted its head with curious innocence. "I know everything about you. Your father's death from pancreatic cancer when you were 19. Your mother's disappointment when you dropped out of the PhD program. Your ex-boyfriend Marcus, who said you were emotionally unavailable. Your recurring nightmare about drowning in dark water." Sarah's hand froze on the radio dial. Those details weren't in any file, weren't in any record that something could access. They were private, personal, locked away in memories she'd shared with no one. "How do you know that?" The thing wearing her face pressed closer to the glass, its black void eyes reflecting the observation room's fluorescent lights like oil slicks. "I've been inside your head since you arrived, tasting your thoughts, learning your patterns. You humans are so beautifully complex, layer upon layer of fear and desire and secret shame." The tower of bodies swayed slightly, other faces appearing at different windows. Sarah recognized them from Torres's files now, decades of missing lookouts all staring at her with those same empty eye sockets. They moved in perfect unison, speaking with one voice that came from multiple throats. "We were all so isolated," they chorused. "So grateful for any contact, any connection. It offers friendship, understanding, love, everything we've been missing. All we have to do is open the door." "I won't," Sarah said, backing toward the radio equipment. "I won't let you in." Her doppelganger laughed, the sound exactly matching Sarah's own laugh, but wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. "Oh, but you will. Because I'm not just outside anymore, am I? I'm in here with you." Sarah spun around and found herself face to face with another version of herself, this one standing behind the radio equipment, blocking her access to communication with the outside world. The second false Sarah was identical to the first, except for small details that were increasingly wrong: teeth that were slightly too sharp, skin that had a phosphorescent pallor, fingernails that had grown into small claws. "You let me in the moment you spoke to Frank." This second version explained conversationally. "The moment you acknowledged our existence, you created a connection. And connections work both ways." Sarah realized with dawning horror that she was surrounded. Every reflective surface in the observation room window's computer screens, the surface of her coffee mug, now showed distorted versions of herself staring back. They moved independently of her movements, smiled when she frowned, spoke when her mouth was closed. "We're not invaders," the original false Sarah said from outside the window. "We're liberators. Do you know how exhausting it is to be alone inside your own head? How painful it is to carry all that fear and guilt and loneliness by yourself? We can share the burden," added the version by the radio. "Distribute the pain," said another from the computer screen's reflection. "Make the isolation end forever," whispered a fourth from somewhere behind her. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to shut out the multiple voices, but they continued speaking directly into her mind now. She could feel them moving through her thoughts like cold fingers, examining her memories, tasting her emotions. "Your father didn't just die from cancer," they whispered inside her skull. "He gave up, chose to stop treatment because he couldn't bear the thought of becoming a burden. You never forgave him for abandoning you, and you never forgave yourself for being relieved when it was over." "Stop!" Sarah gasped. Marcus was right about you being emotionally unavailable. You use isolation as a shield, push people away before they can leave you first. That's why this job appealed to you, not the money or the purpose, but the chance to be alone where no one could hurt you. Stop. But we understand. We've felt that same isolation, that same fear of abandonment. We can take it away, make you part of something larger. You'll never be alone again. Sarah opened her eyes and found that all the false versions of herself had moved closer. The one outside was pressing its palms against the glass, now leaving smeared handprints that glowed with phosphorescent light. The others had emerged fully from their reflective surfaces and were standing around her in a circle. "Just open the door," they said in unison. "Let us in completely. Become part of the family." For a moment, Sarah was tempted. The loneliness had been crushing, not just the 3 weeks at Tower 7, but years of self-imposed isolation, of pushing away anyone who tried to get close. The things wearing her face were offering an end to that pain, a connection so complete, she'd never be alone again. But in that moment of temptation, she remembered something Frank had said: it feeds on our fear. The creature didn't just want her body as camouflage. It wanted her terror, her despair, her willingness to surrender. It had spent weeks learning her psychological vulnerabilities, crafting the perfect trap. Sarah grabbed the emergency flare gun from Frank's equipment locker and pointed it at the false Sarah by the radio. "You're not offering connection," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You're offering consumption. You want to hollow me out and wear my skin." The false Sarahs tilted their heads in perfect synchronization, their expressions shifting from gentle persuasion to cold hunger. "You're more perceptive than the others," they acknowledged. "Most succumbed to the promise of belonging. Frank lasted longer than most, but even he eventually believed we could ease his pain. What happens if I refuse? Then we take you anyway," they said simply. "The willing make better hosts. They struggle less during the integration process. But unwilling will suffice. We've waited too long to let you escape like the others." The thing outside began pressing harder against the glass hairline cracks spreading from its palms. The tower of bodies swayed but held firm, dozens of dead eyes watching Sarah's every move. She realized that the observation room's windows were designed to keep weather out, not supernatural predators. The glass would hold for minutes at most. Sarah activated the tower's emergency beacon, sending an automated distress signal to Ranger headquarters. But even if Torres responded immediately, it would be hours before help arrived. She needed to survive until dawn, when whatever laws governed this creature might force it to retreat. "Frank said it can't climb smooth metal," she called out, hoping Frank's spirit could still hear her. "What else can't it do?" Frank's voice whispered from the radio speaker, barely audible under the static. "Light hurts it. Fire burns it. Salt disrupts its form. But most important, it can only maintain stolen shapes for limited time. When dawn comes, it has to return to its true form." Sarah looked at her watch, 11:47 p.m. 6 hours until sunrise. The glass was cracking faster, now spiderweb patterns spreading across all the windows. Soon, the observation room would be compromised. But Sarah had an idea. The glass shattered inward with a sound like breaking bells, showering Sarah with crystalline fragments. The false Sarah outside flowed through the opening like liquid shadow, its form becoming less human and more amorphous as it entered the observation room. The tower of bodies collapsed as the creature withdrew its energy from maintaining multiple forms, leaving only the original entity, and it was nothing like the human shape it had been wearing. Sarah triggered the emergency flare just as the thing reached for her, filling the observation room with brilliant red light. The creature recoiled with a shriek that sounded like metal tearing its stolen features, melting away to reveal something that belonged to nightmares. Pale, translucent flesh rippled over a framework that might once have been bones. Too many joints, too many angles, appendages that seemed to shift between arms and tentacles depending on the viewing angle. The flare bought her precious seconds to execute her plan. Sarah had realized that the observation room's position 80 feet above ground, surrounded by metal framework, made it more than just a refuge. It made it a giant Faraday cage. If she could channel the tower's electrical systems correctly. She grabbed the weather station's lightning rod assembly and yanked it inside, creating a direct connection between the tower's metal frame and the observation room. Then she activated every piece of electronic equipment simultaneously: radios, computers, emergency systems, even the coffee maker. The tower's solar batteries discharged in a massive electrical surge that turned the entire observation room into a conductor. The creature convulsed as electricity arced through its form, the stolen human features fragmenting into component pieces. Sarah caught glimpses of Frank's face, other missing lookouts, people she didn't recognize, all the identities it had absorbed over decades of hunting. They screamed in unison as the electrical field disrupted whatever force bound them to this thing. But the surge lasted only seconds before the batteries died, plunging the observation room into darkness. The creature reformed almost immediately, though its shape was less stable now, flickering between human and something else entirely. "Clever," it hissed with voices that belonged to the dead. "But temporary. Pain only makes us hungrier." Sarah had one flare left, and maybe 3 hours until dawn. The creature circled her in the darkness, its form barely visible except when it passed in front of the moonlight streaming through the broken windows. She could hear it testing different approaches, sometimes moving like a human, sometimes flowing like liquid, sometimes making sounds that suggested far too many legs. "You can't run," it whispered. "Can't hide, can't fight. But you can still choose how this ends. Surrender now, and we'll make it quick. Keep struggling, and we'll take our time. Draw out the fear, savor the despair." Sarah pressed herself against the radio equipment, hoping for any contact with the outside world. But the electrical surge had fried most of the electronics. Only the old emergency radio still showed signs of life, a faint amber light that suggested partial functionality. She keyed the microphone with trembling fingers. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Tower 7. I am under attack by something that shouldn't exist. If anyone can hear this, do not send help. Repeat, do not send help. Destroy this location. Burn it to the ground." Static answered her, but underneath it she thought she heard a familiar voice. "Sarah." "This is Torres. I can barely hear you. What's your situation?" The creature laughed, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. "How sweet. Your friend wants to help. Should we tell him what happened to the others who tried to rescue previous lookouts?" Images flashed through Sarah's mind, not her own memories, but the creature's. Rescue teams arriving at the tower to find evidence of struggle but no survivors. Search parties that ventured into the forest and never returned. The thing had been playing this game for decades, using each new victim to lure in more prey. "Torres, get out of here!" Sarah shouted into the radio. "It's a trap. It uses us as bait." But her warning dissolved into static as the creature reached out with an appendage that wasn't quite an arm and wasn't quite a tentacle touching the radio equipment. Sarah felt a shock of cold that seemed to freeze her from the inside out. The thing was trying to push into her mind again, but this time she was ready for it. Sarah had one more weapon in Frank's kit, something the previous lookout had hidden behind the equipment rack. A small mirror wrapped in salt and surrounded by a circle of cold iron nails. Frank's final protection, one that hadn't saved him, but might save her. She grabbed the mirror and held it up between herself and the creature. The thing recoiled immediately, its form becoming even less stable. In the mirror's reflection, Sarah could see what it really looked like, a massive, writhing mass of hungry shadows with eyes like burning coals scattered throughout its darkness. And within those shadows, the faces of everyone it had consumed, trapped and screaming for eternity. "You can't hold that forever," the creature hissed. "Your arm will tire, your concentration will slip, and then we'll be closer than ever before." Sarah checked her watch, 3:33 a.m., 3.5 hours until dawn. Her arm was already shaking from holding up the mirror. The creature was right, she couldn't maintain this defense indefinitely, but she didn't need to defeat the thing. She just needed to survive until sunrise. Dawn came like salvation, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the broken windows and striking the creature's form. It shrieked and began to dissolve its stolen human features, melting away like ice in flame. The faces trapped within its mass, Frank. The missing lookouts, dozens of others looked up at Sarah with expressions of profound gratitude before fading into nothingness. "Free," they whispered with their last breath. Finally free. The creature's true form retreated rapidly, flowing down through gaps in the metal flooring like liquid shadows seeking darkness. Within minutes, nothing remained but the devastation it had left behind: shattered windows, destroyed equipment, and the overwhelming stench of decay. Sarah slumped against the radio equipment, exhausted but alive. The emergency radio crackled to life, Torres's voice cutting through the static with blessed clarity. "Tower 7, this is Torres. I've got a helicopter inbound to your location, ETA 15 minutes. Are you injured?" "I'm alive," Sarah replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But Torres, the tower needs to be destroyed. Whatever's down there, it can't be allowed to—" Her words were cut off by a low rumble that seemed to come from deep underground. The tower swayed slightly, and Sarah felt a vibration through the metal framework that suggested something massive was moving far below. "Sarah, the chopper pilot, is reporting unusual seismic activity in your area." Torres's voice carried new urgency. "We need to get you out of there now." Through the broken windows, Sarah could see the forest changing. Trees were withering at accelerated speed, their leaves turning brown and falling like snow. The grass around the tower base was yellowing, dying in perfect circles that expanded outward from the structure's foundation. Whatever lived beneath Tower 7 was angry about losing its prey and was no longer hiding its presence. The helicopter appeared over the tree line, a welcome sight of human technology in the dying wilderness. But as it descended toward the clearing, Sarah noticed something that made her blood turn cold. The pilot's face was wrong. From this distance, the details were subtle, just a slight asymmetry, a too wide smile eyes that reflected light in a way human eyes shouldn't. The creature hadn't been destroyed by dawn. It had simply retreated long enough to find new prey, new faces to steal. "Torres," Sarah whispered into the radio, "don't let that helicopter land. That's not your pilot." "What are you talking about, Sarah? You've been under extreme stress." "Look at the pilot's eyes, Torres. Really look." A long pause. Then Torres's voice came back tight with fear. "Jesus Christ! All units, we have a code black situation at Tower 7. Do not approach the helicopter. Repeat, do not approach." The false pilot's smile widened as it realized its disguise had been compromised. The helicopter began descending faster, no longer attempting to land safely, but simply to reach the tower before it could be stopped. Sarah grabbed Frank's emergency kit and found what she was hoping for: road flares enough to turn the observation room into a beacon of light. She lit them all at once, filling the space with brilliant illumination that streamed out through the broken windows. The helicopter pilot shrieked the same sound the creature had made during the night and pulled up sharply. But the damage was done. In the harsh light of the flares, Sarah could see the pilot's true nature clearly: a hollow shell puppeted by something that had never been human. The helicopter spun out of control and crashed into the forest beyond the clearing, exploding in a ball of flame that spread rapidly through the dying trees. Sarah watched the fire race outward, consuming the corrupted vegetation with supernatural speed. Whatever had lived beneath Tower 7 for centuries was finally being purged from the earth. Torres's voice crackled through the radio. "Sarah, we're reading massive fires in your area. A real rescue chopper is en route, but it'll be an hour before they can reach you through the smoke." "That's okay," Sarah replied, watching the flames consume the forest. "I think it's finally over." But as she spoke those words, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach drop. The fire was burning in perfect spirals, organized patterns that no natural wildfire could create. The creature wasn't being destroyed by the flames. It was using them, directing them, creating something vast and complex in the dying forest. A summoning circle, miles across, written in fire and death. Sarah looked at her reflection in the cracked glass of the radio equipment and saw her own face staring back, but the eyes were wrong. Had been wrong for hours, maybe, since the moment she'd spoken to Frank's spirit. The creature hadn't been trying to replace her during the night. It had already succeeded. "Torres," she said into the microphone, her voice perfectly calm, perfectly normal. "Cancel the rescue. I've decided to extend my assignment. This place is growing on me." Somewhere far below, something ancient and patient began to laugh.